If you want to know how the next great global conflict unfolds, you don't need to look at military spreadsheets, you don't even need to look at the weapons. You just need to look at a map. Geography is destiny. And today, I'm going to show you a map that dictates the future of the global economy, the survival of the empires, and the exact blueprint for how a modern world war would play out. So let's start right here. Take a look at this narrow strip of blue. This is the Strait of Hormuz. It is the absolute nexus of the modern world. At its narrowest point, this strait is only about 21 miles wide. That's roughly 33 kilometers in the grand scheme of the oceans. And that's nothing. It is a geographical bottleneck, a choke point. And yet, according to the United States Energy Information Administration, roughly 20% of the world's total oil supply flows through this tiny, vulnerable corridor every single day. So let that sink in. 1/5 of the blood that keeps the global economy pumping has to squeeze through a tiny 21-mile gap. So where does it go? It goes east. It fuels the manufacturing powerhouses of Asia. Data from the World Economic Forum and Global Energy Tracker show a terrifying dependency. India gets around 60% of its crude oil from the Middle East. China, around 50%. But Japan is the most exposed. According to Japan's own Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry, Japan relies on the Middle East for over 90% of its crude oil imports. If the Strait of Hormuz were to be fully blockaded, if that circle closes, the clock starts ticking immediately. Strategic reserves would drain, supply chains would freeze. We're talking about the potential collapse of the Japanese industrial economy in a matter of months. And that is exactly why Iran consistently holds the threat of closing this strait over the head of the international community. It is the ultimate kill switch for the global economy. But let's flip the perspective. Let's look at the Arab states on the other side of the water. The Gulf Cooperation Council, or the GCC, countries like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar, they all send out oil out through the strait. But what comes in? Survival. The GCC nations are incredibly wealthy, but they are built on an artificial premise. They are glittering multi-million person metropolises built in the middle of a desert where there is naturally no food or no surface water. According to the research from Chatham House, a premier international affairs think tank, the GCC countries import up to 85% of their food. 85%. It comes in on ships, it does not grow in the sand. If the Strait of Hormuz is shut down, it is not just the world that loses oil. The Gulf states lose their food supply, and they would face catastrophic starvation. The GCC represents something even bigger than just regional wealth. They are the linchpin of the American financial empire. And why is that? 2 words: the petrodollar. Back in the 1970s, the United States struck a historical deal with Saudi Arabia. The agreement was simple. The U.S. would provide military protection, and in exchange, Saudi Arabia and eventually the rest of the OPEC agreed to the price of all their oil exports exclusively in US dollars. So this means that if they say any country in the world wants to buy oil, they have to hold American currency. This creates an artificial, massive, and permanent global demand for the US dollar. It is the foundation of the American economic supremacy. So if the Gulf states collapse, the petrodollar system fractures. And if the petrodollar fractures, the shockwaves would hit Washington instantly. Look at this map. Look at the terrain. On the eastern side, you have Iran. Notice the elevation. These are the Zagros Mountains. It is a massive, rugged, natural fortress of stone. On the western side, you have the GCC. It is entirely flat. It's an exposed desert plain. In military terms, this is what we call an extreme asymmetric geography. It is not a fair fight. Inside those Iranian mountains, military forces can carve out deep subterranean bases. They can hide their mobile missile launchers, they can bunker down entire fleets of offensive suicide drones, and because they are deep inside the mountains, they are incredibly difficult to target from the air. From that high ground fortress, Iran has a direct, unobstructed line of sight to fire down onto the flat, exposed deserts of the GCC. And what are they aiming at? First, American military bases. The US has installations scattered all across the region. Defending against a localized massive swarm of cheap drones fired from mountain caves is a logistical nightmare. Second is energy infrastructure. We saw this reality back in 2019 when drones struck the Saudi Aramco processing facilities at Abqaiq. It is frighteningly easy for a cheap remote-controlled drone to cause $1 billion of damage to an exposed oil refinery. But the third target is the most critical. It's water. The Gulf states have almost no natural fresh water. To keep their population alive, they rely on desalination. And according to the World Bank, the Middle East accounts for nearly half of the world's desalination capacity. So that's huge vulnerable coastal factories that suck in salt water, boil it, or push it through membranes and turn it into drinking water. In countries like the UAE, nearly all municipal water comes from these plants. If a drone strike hits an oil rig, you lose money. If a drone strike hits a desalination plant, you lose your society. The Gulf nations are sitting ducks. They are highly developed, but they are hyper fragile. But Iran is not invincible. Iran has its own catastrophic weakness. And while they have mountain fortresses, that fortress is running completely dry. So according to the World Resource Institute, Iran is facing extreme water stress. Years of severe droughts, climate shifts, and poor water management have drained their aquifers. In a total war scenario, the counter strategy from the West and its allies wouldn't just be bombing military targets, it would be targeting infrastructure, dams, power grids, reservoirs. If you destroy the infrastructure of a country already dying of thirst, that mountain fortress suddenly becomes a mountain prison. The goal would be to make the conditions inside Iran so unlivable that the population rises up against its own government, sparking a massive internal refuge crisis. This is the grim reality of modern geopolitics. Both sides have their fingers on buttons that can utterly destroy the other's ability to sustain human life. It is a grand, terrifying game of chicken. And the sociology of these two sides makes this game even more dangerous. You have Iran driven by a hardline religious ideology that historically embraces martyrdom. They have shown a willingness to endure massive economic and human suffering for their geopolitical goals. Then on the other side, you have the GCC. It's wealthy, highly commercialized. Take a look at Dubai. According to global demographic data, nearly 90% of the population in the UAE are expatriates, foreign workers. They are there for commerce. They are there for lifestyle. If the power goes out, if the water stops flowing, if the missiles start flying, what do you think that 90% is going to do? They are going to leave instantly. The entire economic workforce would evaporate overnight. So where does this leave the rest of the world? If this tinderbox ignites into a full regional war, we are forced into asking three impossible questions. First, the US ground war. Will the United States be forced to commit ground troops? Historically, aerial bombardment alone cannot permanently destroy a well-entrenched mountainous adversary. But committing to the hundreds of thousands of US troops needed to topple a regime in Iran would make Iraq look like a training exercise. Second would be nuclear escalation. If either side is fundamentally losing a war that threatens their very survival, would they cross that ultimate red line? Then third, we have the global players. This isn't just about the Middle East, it's about Europe, Great Britain, France, and Germany, and they're already sounding the alarms about the precarious nature of this region. And if NATO nations commit, we have to look at Russia and China. Given their massive geopolitical alignment and energy ties with Iran, would they step in to secure their own lifelines? If that happens, that map that you're looking at right now becomes the flashpoint for World War III. Because all roads lead back to the GCC, the linchpin of the American empire. And it's not just oil, it's investments. When the Gulf nations sell their crude oil for US dollars, they take those massive profits and pour them into sovereign wealth funds. We're talking about trillions of dollars from Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Kuwait. So where does the money all go? It flows directly back into the American financial system. Since 2012, this trend has been absolutely exploding. They buy US treasuries, but more importantly, they buy US equities. They pour their wealth into the American stock market because it's the safest, most liquid place on earth. But what happens if the pipeline gets cut? What happens if the GCC is completely isolated and forced to liquidate their holdings just to survive? These sovereign wealth funds would aggressively pull out of the American stock market. They would sell off their massive stakes in the giants of the US tech, companies like Apple, Microsoft, Google, Nvidia, the artificial intelligence engines that currently drive a huge chunk of the US market growth. If those investments vanish overnight, the stock market plunges. The economic engine stalls. So, as we look at this map, we understand that this is not an isolated conflict in a desert. It is a perfectly balanced, hyper-fragile ecosystem of money, water, oil, and terrain. A single drone strike, a single naval blockade, a single desperate move from a mountain fortress could cascade into a global economic depression. This is the situation. It is complex, it is terrifying, and over the next few weeks, we're going to dive deep into each specific layer of this puzzle to understand precisely where we can go from here.